It's my pleasure to be here today and provide you a high-level summary of the work I do as a medical officer. I'm going to start right off, and I'm trying to avoid jargon, but there will be some mistakes I might make. And one particular mistake is that I'm a medical officer, or MO, but I could also be called a clinical reviewer or a medical reviewer. So if I use those terms, I'm talking about me still. So those are synonyms. And then in addition, my talk today will be referring to new molecular entities for NDAs or original BLAs. The review process is slightly different, or actually significantly different for other kinds of submissions. But in the interest of time, I'm focusing on NMEs and original BLAs. So today, I'm hoping I can get 4 things across to you. I'm hoping that you'll have an idea of the major activities and milestones that the MO will perform during the NDA or BLA review. I'm hoping that you'll recognize the importance of the submissions organization and completeness to me, the medical officer, and also identify considerations that are included in the MO's risk-benefit assessment. And I'm hoping that you'll be able to give some examples of strategies that the MO might use to recommend for mitigating adverse reactions of a product. So the outline, I'm going to start with a background. I'm going to tell you about what my job is in this process. I'm going to explain who the review team members are. I'll talk about some of the activities that we've discussed earlier and you've discussed in other conferences. And then I'll go into the kind of the nitty-gritty that parallels what Swati and Lois already told you. So they're regulatory project managers. They tell me when I need to do things, and then I'll tell you a little bit about exactly what that is. And that'll be I'm going to break it up into 3 different steps, which I'll explain in a bit. So my role is to review the efficacy and safety data that's generated in the clinical trial and perform a benefit risk assessment for that product, for that indication. Then I need to, after I've done that, I need to make a recommendation of whether a product should be approved. And then if it's approved, I have to make a recommendation about how the product should be labeled, potential post-marketing requirements or commitments that should be requested, and developing risk management plans if they're needed. So, but I'm not alone. This is a diagram of some of the team members that we would have in my division. I work in the division of antiviral products, so we have a virologist. Not everyone has a virologist, but we work together for INDs and then NDAs, and it might be the same team members that carry forward the same people that might review the IND, would then also review the NDA or the BLA. And then in this initial, we might also have additional expertise. For example, if our antiviral product is being delivered by a device, we would have CDRH. But there's other people we might ask to join the review team because of a certain safety issue or something like that. And the NDA, BLA, before that comes in general, this isn't coming out of nowhere. We generally know this product pretty well. We know the applicant or the sponsor pretty well. And we're really familiar with a lot of these studies in most cases because we've been communicating. If it wasn't me, it was one of my colleagues, and I have those documents, or maybe my team leader and certainly our division. There'll be institutional memory of all the things that have happened up until that NDA BLA submission. And during that process, I'll have an understanding of what maybe the safety issues are. I might have an idea of how effective the product is likely to be. And also during these important meetings, particularly end of phase 2 meetings, when we're talking about the study design for the phase 3 studies, I'll have an input. I'll be able to provide you with information about what will lead to approval. You'll tell me your perspective. So it won't, when the NDA BLA application comes through, we shouldn't really be terribly surprised. In addition, we have the pre-BLA BLA meeting. And so in that meeting, you'll talk about the data that you're going to present. You're going to explain exactly how you're thinking of presenting the data, how you're organizing the files and things like that. So I'll have an idea. It shouldn't really be a surprise. I'm going to use this diagram to kind of organize my talk. This is for NMEs. And here I've had this is a standard review clock, and this is part of the program as mentioned before, so that's why it's 12 months rather than 10 months, and then for priority review, it's 8 months rather than 6 months because it's part of the program. And the first red, you see the box in red, which is the pre-submission activities. Those are what I've already told you about, all the things that happen in the IND. I'm going to talk to you about the next steps would be as soon as we receive that application, that determination whether or not we can file the NDA or BLA application, and during that planning process, that first immediate 2 months or so when we first received the application. And then I'll talk about what we actually do during the conduct and the meat of what we're doing during that review period, and then some of the wrap-up activities as they pertain to the MO. So I'm going to begin by talking about this first period during filing. So at the top, in the darker purple, I've shown you the milestones. So these are the meetings that Swati and Lois are going to set up, and things they're going to tell me, you have to do this by this date, and they're going to have a whole calendar out. And then below that is actually, this is what I'm going to actually having to do. So when I'm determining fileability from the clinical standpoint, now everybody else on the review team is determining fileability from their perspectives, from whether it's the chemistry and manufacturing or the non-clinical, but we're determining whether the submission is of sufficient quality and completeness to permit a substantive review. And then we're going to be planning it. So to give you some specifics about some of the things we actually do to determine whether this application is the work we do right up in the very beginning of receiving the application to try to determine that this is sufficiently complete and organized. The first one is it organized? So we'll go through, we'll be looking through all this documents. You just heard all this, the ECTD. We're going to be really relying on this organization to be able to quickly go through. And I will literally look for things in, say, Module 2, because that's where the clinical summaries are. I'm going to be looking to see, can I find this? I'm going to be clicking on it and reading it, making sure it's in English, and making sure I can read it, that there hasn't been some problem, and then that the document is actually where, under the title, where I would need to be able to find it. Next is I'm going to be looking, really part of the same process is as I'm going through the application, I have a checklist and I'm looking, I know I need these things. I won't be able to perform my review if I don't have this information. So I'm going to be clicking on things like the cover letter, which can, you all are communicating to me what's in the application. I'll be looking for the financial certification disclosure, information about pediatrics. I'll be looking at that draft labeling. Right off the bat, I'll be looking at the label to see what are they saying that this product is for, or how have they organized it? Is it consistent with labeling guidelines? And the next issue, now this, I'll be looking at the pivotal clinical trials. Now, as I mentioned before, I really shouldn't be surprised at this point at the NDA BLA about what trials were submitted. But I'll be looking to make sure that those pivotal clinical trials are adequate and well controlled. And I'll have to look to see whether the study designs were adequate to support the proposed indication. And did the trials adequately collect safety and effectiveness data? Now, some of these issues might not be filing issues because I can't determine them right off the bat by, in the matter of a few weeks in trying to familiarize myself with the data. So it's possible that I might determine that, yes, it's fileable, but then later on during the review process, whatever my suspicions were in the beginning turns out that maybe it might lead to a complete response. But my goal is to identify this very early on and communicate this. The next thing I do is I look at the electronic data sets. So I'll go and look at those defined files, and I'll look at those review guides and make sure, are the variables that I'm going to need to perform my analysis, are they included in those defined files? Do they seem to be, are they going to provide enough guidance for me to be able to do the analyses that I need to do? And then I'll actually upload the data to some of our FDA review tools. So I tend to use JUMP or JUMP Clinical. Other people use JReview. There are other review tools that we use. But what I'll do is I'll actually upload the data and I'll recreate some of these tables. For example, not everyone does the exact same thing, but I might look at demographics. Am I finding the same number of patients that are enrolled in the study that the sponsor or applicant says? Is it consistent with the label in a general sense? if in the very beginning, I'm not going to be expecting that the way that I've looked at the data is going to be perfect. So if it's a little off, that might be okay. But I need to be able to at least create these tables using this data. And I'm going to be looking to say, let me look at severe adverse events, because I know that's really important. So let me look and make sure that it seems like I'm getting the data that's consistent with what, for example, they put in their draft label. And then all during this part while we're determining fileability, I'm also thinking in my head about the planning. So I'll be thinking about what are the key review issues. So for example, if there's a concern about a drug-drug interaction, maybe a lot of patients received another drug, and therefore the drug levels might be higher in those individuals. How am I gonna look at that key review issue? What team members do I need? Then we have this issue of determining whether or not this is a priority or a standard review clock. Now, as we've already mentioned, 4 months, we have to do this 4 months faster if it's a priority review clock. And we're the ones in the division that determine whether or not this would be appropriate. And just, I'm going to read the legal language, but priority review is given to drugs that offer major advances in the treatment or provide a treatment where no adequate therapies exist. So for example, if pediatrics have no drug for that, no drug to treat that disease, and that disease exists in children, then that would probably be something that would get priority review. I'll also be determining, is there additional FDA expertise that I need beyond what would be part of what we normally do? And that, obviously, the device would probably have been enrolled earlier, but maybe there's a safety issue and I need a cardiologist, or I need someone who's an expert at EKGs or those kind of assessments. And then early on, someone asked earlier in the day, when do we determine whether an advisory committee is needed? We want to know as early as possible too, because it's very difficult to plan. This is a lot of scheduling, and we know that you all will have to do a lot of work to prepare for advisory committee meetings. So if I can identify this early, and sometimes it's pretty obvious that there's something controversial, then we'll start planning that very early on. And then we'll be deciding, is this product going to need a risk evaluation and mitigation strategy, or a REMS? In addition, we're already starting to talk about the chemistry, manufacturing, inspection planning, because this needs to be done well in advance. And then also, as an MO, I'll be speaking with people about the clinical sites. Say there are 25 sites. Probably can't visit them all to have them all inspected, but I'll be speaking with the people who actually will do the inspecting on what should be the priority. Is there a site that enrolled the most amount of people? Is there a site that seemed to have more protocol violations? These kind of things. So this will happen very early on, or as early as possible in the process. So next I'll talk about the meat of conducting the clinical review, which the MO does. So the milestones, again, we'll have a mid-cycle meeting, mid-cycle communication, and by the end of this period, I need to have my review complete, which means I have to do a lot of work during this period. I have to do the efficacy and safety analysis. I have to identify and communicate with the applicant any major deficiencies that I'm finding that I wasn't able to detect earlier on. I need to perform that risk-benefit assessment. I need to work on draft labeling. I need to develop, if I need a REMS, I need to start developing that. I need to consult people in the agency who can help me do that, who have experience in that area. And I need to, if PMRs or PMCs are required or needed, for example, pediatrics. If I know that we're going to need to do pediatric studies, then I'm going to be starting to put that language together for what will be required. So a little bit more into the analysis of efficacy. So I work very closely with the statistician for the analysis of efficacy. Typically, the statistician will lead the actual analysis. So they'll determine what statistical test is appropriate, whether the applicant used the right statistical test. But my input is needed to determine whether that's important clinically. So for example, if an endpoint, if they demonstrate that there's a 2-hour earlier resolution of a problem, it's my job to say, what does that mean to patients? Because obviously if it's severe pain, 2 hours might need a lot, but if it's sniffling, perhaps not. So it's my job to use my clinical expertise to help put all this data into context. So we'll be reviewing the data integrity. We'll review the study design, the conduct, and the limitations of the study. We'll perform the analysis of the primary endpoint and think about whether the results support the effectiveness of the product. Then we'll also perform additional analyses. We'll look at the secondary endpoints and see, do they seem to, are they lining up with the primary endpoints? Does this seem to tell the same story about this product, about its effectiveness? And then we'll be doing demographic subpopulation analyses, which are required, and that includes race, gender, and age. And then we'll also do additional subgroup analyses. I mentioned before that there might be a lot of patients taking a certain drug, and there might be a drug-drug interaction there. I might look there to say, okay, does this patient population, do they also achieve the same kind of effectiveness, or is the effectiveness in this patient population lower? So my primary job is the analysis of safety. So I need to identify potential safety review issues, and I do this through reviewing the data that's submitted in these data files and comparing that with the clinical study reports and the other summaries that have been provided. I'll assess whether a safety issue is real, and I'll try to determine if it's related to the study drug. The applicant will have decided that, yes, it's related or it's not related, but I have to go, I'll read the narrative that you provided me to try to determine, do I agree with what they've determined, that this is related to the underlying disease and not the drug. And then I also have to determine, what does this safety event mean to patients? So for example, if there's a laboratory abnormality, well, there are some laboratory abnormalities that might, be a grade 3 on some sort of data table, but maybe they resolve on their own, and maybe the clinicians aren't that concerned about it, so it can be monitored, and then by the next time they're visited, they're seen by the physician, it's resolved. That might not matter too much to the patient. On the other hand, there might be some other laboratory abnormalities that would prompt an exhaustive and possibly invasive investigation, and that might mean a lot more to the patient. So this is where I have to use my clinical experience. And then I need to recommend approaches to mitigate identified risks. So there might be that severe events happen, but maybe because the drug provides a lot of benefit to a lot of people, that there's some way that we can weigh both of those things and be able to try to be as safe as we can. And I need to think about that as I'm reviewing. I'm looking at a lot of factors. I'm looking at the safety database and determining whether or not the population that's included in the safety database is reflective of the patients who are actually going to receive the drug outside of clinical trials. I'll be looking at data integrity. I'll be looking at the adequacy of safety monitoring. I'll be spending a lot of time on events like death, serious adverse events, and then adverse events that lead to study discontinuation. I'll be reading all the narratives there and try to see if I can get a story, if there's a story there of some sort of thing that's likely related to the drug. And then I'll also be looking at other patterns that may be less severe events, but they're treatment emergent or maybe clearly adverse reactions, and determining, okay, what should be the plan for these kinds of events. I'll be looking at laboratory abnormalities, ECGs, vital signs, and then immunogenicity. Does this drug cause anti-drug antibodies? Are a large proportion of people enrolled having these anti-drug antibodies? And if so, what's happening to them? Is the drug not working as well? Are they developing some sort of anaphylactic reaction? These are all things I'll have to evaluate. I'll also look at safety by demographic subgroup, and then I'll also perform the subgroup analyses as appropriate. For example, maybe there's a certain subgroup, for example, patients with renal dysfunction. I need to make sure that that patient population doesn't have a different kind of safety signal as a result of their comorbidity. So now I have all this information, and I have to perform a benefit risk assessment. And in doing that, I really have to consider the condition. How serious is the condition? What treatments do the patients right now have available to them? What are the inconveniences of those? What are the adverse events that occur because of those therapies? And then I look at the pivotal trials. What were the strengths of these trials? What are the limitations? What questions do I still not know after reviewing this trial data? And I'll be looking at the trial endpoints. As I mentioned before, is it relevant? Is 2 hours relevant to this patient population? And then what is the magnitude and durability of the product's effects? including across these subpopulations. I'll be looking at the safety database. Is it appropriate for the number of patients who will potentially get this drug after approval? And then what about the adverse reactions? How frequent are they? How severe are they? Do they resolve on their own? Are they treatable? And then risk management options, REMS options, and also labeling. So tomorrow there's a lecture at 9:40 in the morning about labeling. So I'm not going to go into great detail, but this is really the bulk of what we do. Besides approving drugs, we also label them so that clinicians and patients are able to understand as best we can what actually happened in the clinical trials and what the safest way to use them and what the risks are associated with them. The negotiations about labeling usually happen in writing, usually in comment bubbles, and they occur throughout the process. So there might be that one section we start right off the bat. Oftentimes we'll start with the indication. We don't agree with your indication. Your clinical trial enrolled these patients, but you're with this diagnosis, but now you'd like to have this other indication. These kind of communications would happen earlier on. There are a lot of there are regulations for the labeling, and there's numerous guidances for each section of the label. So I urge you, if it's time for you to submit a draft label, please look at these references because they're very helpful. But by the end of this whole process, the entire label will be reviewed by relevant disciplines, including experts in medication error prevention. They'll go behind us and say, like, well, look what they've written. Will somebody really understand what that means when you give this step 3 of using a syringe or something like that? Or using the language, making sure that the language for the patients is appropriate. So I'm providing this as a highlights of a draft label, just to give you a sense of what I might do if I have an adverse reaction. So I have a whole bunch of different options. I could include it in adverse reactions, which is basically a summary of the adverse reactions that happened in the trial. I can put it in warnings and precautions, which kind of elevates it. It makes it a little bit more prominent of a feature. So if it's really important that it needs a little bit more communication about that issue, it'll be there. I can put a contraindication. If there's a certain patient population who had very bad outcomes or were more likely to have a severe event, I can say it's contraindicated in that patient population. And then I can also put it in a boxed warning. And then, of course, I could use a REMS, which would be also communicated here. So these are some of the options I'll have to think about as I'm reviewing and seeing these safety events that occur. So a little bit more on the REMS. So these are designed to help reduce the occurrence and/or severity of certain serious risks by informing and/or supporting the execution of safe use conditions as described in the FDA-approved prescribing information. And this is just an example of a long-acting Zyprexa, which can be very helpful because it's long-acting for patients who are experiencing schizophrenia, but it also has serious sedation, including coma. So this is very severe, yet it also could provide benefit for a certain patient population. So this REMS program is designed. Everyone who has to, the patients, the prescribers are all enrolled in this, and so this is a way that we can provide access to the public to this medication, but limit it to people who can benefit and keep it away from people who maybe aren't likely to get that benefit, but likely to get the risk. So a bit about post-marketing requirements, PMRs, and post-marketing commitments. We have the authority to require drug manufacturers to conduct post-marketing safety studies and clinical trials to assess possible serious risks associated with drugs. Frequently, we have pediatric PMRs. They're often required under the Pediatric Research Equity Act, or PREA. And then other PMRs or PMCs might be the product or disease specific. For example, in our division, we have a lot of, we'll have PMCs or even PMRs related to virology problems, so resistance, mutations, and things like that that might develop for antiviral products. So now I'll talk about the wrap-up activities. By this time, as a medical officer, if things are going well, my job might be almost done. I mean, I might have a few paperwork, and the regulatory project managers, they're the ones having to put all this together But on the other hand, it could be that there are still issues that have not been resolved. And one of the big, so some of the things that have to happen are this late cycle meeting. We might have to conduct an advisory committee meeting. We'll have a wrap-up meeting, and then senior leadership concurrence. And oftentimes we'll actually get the senior leadership involved as early as possible, so that we don't end up late in the cycle trying to figure out how to figure out our way through difficult issues. So the activities I might have to do would be helping with the advisory committee activities, approvability, which would be paperwork potentially by this point, finalizing the label, developing these final PMRs and PMCs, and this will be negotiated with the sponsor, and developing those final REMS if they're needed. So as an MO, my role for the advisory committee meeting, as one of our speakers mentioned today, there are typically a standing advisory committee, a board, and many of them are voting. So for us, we share these individuals are infectious disease specialists. But it might be that for a certain advisory committee, maybe there's some issue related to cardiac events. So we might need to have a cardiologist and make sure that that expertise is on that board. Or maybe there's a virus. For example, we had an advisory committee meeting last summer on smallpox. So you might need to have people who've actually studied smallpox. So I also might have to present. In fact, often the MO does present the part of the FDA's perspective to the advisory committee meeting. And then the applicant will also present their perspective, and then the members will vote on each of these issues. Oh, I forgot. I also have to provide questions. So we ask, just like you ask us specific questions, we ask the advisory committee for answers to specific questions. For example, it might be, should we approve this drug? But other times it's maybe something a little bit more nuanced. So then, by this point, hopefully we have an NDA BLA decision, and hopefully it's approval, but it also could be a complete response at this time. So in conclusion, the MO is responsible for reviewing the efficacy and safety data from clinical trials, and then to use that information to perform a benefit-risk analysis. The groundwork for the NDA BLA review takes place during the IND process, and a well-organized ECTD submission and complete NDA BLA submissions allows us to efficiently determine fileability and initiate our review. And the same is true for the electronic data sets. If they're organized and complete, if the defined file provides me the information I need to analyze the safety data, this enables me to get my job done faster and be able to hopefully get the process moving quickly. And then the MO will make a recommendation about whether the product should be approved and how, if approved, the product should be labeled. So I have a challenge question. Ready? So which of the following strategies may a medical officer recommend to mitigate the risk of an adverse reaction demonstrated in a clinical trial? Anyone for box warning? It's the end of the day, so I'm going to just go with E. You're right. So I'd like to acknowledge many people helped me with this, and including some of my, I've really appreciated them sharing their slides, because this really fit in for me. I didn't have to say a lot of things because they had already mentioned many things. Here's some resources, and then I can answer questions.
All right, we've got a nice 9 minutes left for questions here. This is lovely. So here in the room, again, if you have a question specific to an application or something else that you have in front of the agency and you'd like to get a different answer from Virginia, don't bother coming up. But if you do have general questions about anything that she covered, please come on up. If they're more specific, more detailed, we can do those in the individual sessions we'll have here in a minute. But please, as long as you, whoop, and that's right not on. Just a second. Oh, there we go. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sonia Lohr. I'm interested in your perspective on the importance of the jump review tools and how important it is that the data sets comply to all the CDISC standards. I mean, we had a nice presentation about the things that they might reject on, but there are, you know, jillions of CDISC standards under there. And I don't know how deep those criteria are. And for us in industry, those standards are changing over time, and drug development goes over 10 years. And so it's really hard for us to submit a file with current standards when the trials were done a long time ago.
So I'm sure that is a challenge. I can't speak to all the requirements because I'm not familiar with all the requirements, but certainly what I need is more than those first four. My impression is that that's the beginning. But so it's really, I think if you focus on what you needed to do to perform the analysis, that's probably the things that we're going to need too. So for example, if I need to know, I need to make sure it's not, sometimes it's, I can't figure out how the sponsor did what they did, but I need to know which of the two groups that, you know, they have the placebo group or the comparator arm and the treatment group, and I need to have a clear flag of where those differences. So a lot of what problems I have would be solved if the applicant just makes sure to include in my data sets everything they had and that the title is something I can recognize. So most of the things I need from a safety perspective are SAEs, death, led to discontinuation. So I think a lot of these things would be a lot of the flags that you're already looking at to perform your safety analysis. And of course, it's the same, the title, that's the difference of 10 years ago, is that the column title used to be something different. And that is a problem, especially if I'm looking at data sets together.
All right. If there's other questions in the room, please come up onto the microphones. Those of you online, if you haven't already typed your questions in the Q&A pod, right down in the lower right-hand corner of the screen, you can type those in. But let's go to our first online question, please.
If there is not an established pharmacological class for your drug or biologic, at what point is this reviewed by FDA?
I don't remember exactly, but I think it's, I mean, I think we make the decision probably. I think it's during the NDA BLA process that the final decision is made. And in our division, it's our virologists and the ClinPharm reviewers who work together to do. I think that's when the negotiation takes place.
All right. Any other questions in the room? Come on up to the mics. Let's go with our next online question, please.
Have you ever participated in an informal orientation meeting, and if so, did you find it helpful?
An informal orientation meeting?
That is the only information provided by the questioner.
Oh.
Could you
Okay.
repeat that clarification, please, for the audience online to hear?
So there's an optional meeting, and now I know what you're talking about. This is a newer concept. So I haven't done this, but I believe we're doing this in an upcoming submission. So that I don't have enough experience to weigh in on whether this has been helpful or not, but my expectation is it will be helpful. It's a meeting to basically orient us to what you performed, the analysis you performed. So it could be very helpful, particularly if there's complex issues. And give an opportunity to right off the bat help us understand what you've done.
Okay. And I just got the nod that there's no more online questions for right now, which means all of you are keeping your questions for Virginia for when you get to see her in just a few minutes individually. But please help me thank Virginia for coming and talking with us.